on the outskirts of a fading town in Montana, where forgotten roads wind through fields of frost and silence lingers longer than memory. A yellow Labrador sat behind rusted bars, sun-moving, unbarking, unclaimed. He wasn't a pet, not anymore, just lot number 198, a shadow of something once noble. Most walked past him without a glance, until one man stopped, and that changed everything. What if the dog no one wanted held the key to a story buried by silence and war? What if his rescue wasn't the end but the beginning of a revelation? Before we begin, let us know in the comments where in the world are you listening from. The wind had a bite to it that morning in Denton, Montana, slicing through the rows of cattle pens and vendor tents like a blade of frost. The late autumn sky hung low, bruised with slate-colored clouds, and the muddy gravel beneath the boots of auction-goers squelched with every step. Denton was a speck on the Maypan aging town, surrounded by acres of wheat stubble and pinewood silence. People came here not for glamour, but for cheap deals and overlooked things. The annual fall livestock auction brought in ranchers, hoarders, and the occasional drifter looking to barter for chickens, scrap, or secondhand tools. Among the loud bleating of goats and clamor of steel gates, no one noticed the dog in the far corner. Not really. He was tethered to a rusting post with a frayed rope, barely sheltered under a sheet metal lean-to. His fur, once likely thick and golden, had dulled into a yellowed cream, matted in patches with dirt and dried blood. He wasn't large, maybe 60 pounds, but the way his ribs pushed through his sides made him look even smaller. A tag tied to the pen read simply, Lot 198. He didn't bark, didn't whimper. His amber eyes didn't scan the crowd like the other dogs. They stayed fixed on the gravel, distant, like he was already halfway gone. Jesse Moore wasn't supposed to be at the auction that day. At 32, he'd only recently returned to Denton after his discharge from the Army. His face was angular, with a faint scar slicing through his right eyebrow, his skin weather-worn from years under foreign suns. Jesse stood tall, broad-shouldered in a military surplus jacket, boots still caked in desert sand he hadn't quite washed out of his life. He had come back to fix up the farmhouse his grandfather left him, to be alone, quiet, rebuild, maybe. He'd planned to buy an old post-hole digger from a retiring rancher. Nothing more. The first time he saw Lot 198, Jesse had been reaching for a coffee from a stand run by a woman named Cora Whitmore, an elderly widow with a warm smile and a knack for oversweet cinnamon buns. Jesse barely registered the dog at first, just a shape in the corner of his vision. But then something pulled at him, some unseen thread, and he turned back. That was when their eyes met. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no wagging tail, no whine of recognition, just two souls staring, both worn down by something no one else could see. Jesse took a sip of the lukewarm coffee, then crossed the aisle toward the dog's pen. He crouched. "Hey there," he said softly. The dog didn't move. Just blinked slowly, like he wasn't sure this was real. "Don't waste your breath on that one," a voice muttered behind Jesse. It belonged to Marvin Ellis, one of the older auction hands, stout, balding, with a cigarette perpetually clinging to his lip. That mutt's been through 3 pens this month. No papers. Limp in his back leg, probably used up. He tapped the tag with a pen. No one wants him. Probably gonna get carted off by the meat buyer this afternoon. Jesse stood, but he didn't walk away. Something in the dog's silence reminded him of the base hospital in Germany, of quiet beds lined with men too broken to speak. That same look, that same stillness. The auctioneer's voice crackled over the loudspeaker, announcing lots in rapid-fire monotone. Chickens, goats, a miniature donkey. Then, Lot 198, adult male, Labrador mix, unknown age, no documentation. Do I hear 20? Silence. The air seemed to pause. Jesse's hand went up. The auctioneer blinked, almost surprised. 20. Do I hear 25? No answer. 20. Going once. Twice. Sold. To the gentleman in the green jacket. A receipt was scribbled. Marvin shrugged. Your money. Jesse signed without a word. He walked back to the pen, unhooked the rope, and waited. The dog didn't bolt. He didn't shy away. He simply rose slowly, with Efferton limped forward, each step deliberate. Jesse opened the passenger door of his aging Dodge Ram. The dog climbed in on his own and curled up tight on the floorboard, like it was something he'd done 1,000 times. The ride home was quiet. Jesse didn't turn on the radio. The heater hummed low as they drove past hayfields and wooden fences warped by years. The dog didn't make a sound, didn't look out the window. He just lay there, chest rising and falling like the ticking of a clock counting down to something neither of them could name. When they reached the farmhouse set back from the road, flanked by dying cottonwoods, Jesse parked, cut the engine, and sat a moment, staring at the empty porch. He wasn't sure why he had done it, why he'd raised his hand. He hadn't gone looking for a dog, but now this silence beside him felt right. "Come on," he said finally, pushing open the door. The dog climbed out, limped across the gravel, and followed Jesse to the porch steps. No leash, no hesitation. Inside, Jesse poured a bowl of water, opened a can of chili he thought might tempt the animal, and tossed an old quilt near the fireplace. The dog sniffed it all, then curled into the blanket and closed his eyes. No name, no past, just a lot number. But Jesse couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't rescued the dog, that the dog had rescued him. The following morning, frost had crept in through the cracks in the windows, tracing thin white veins along the glass. Jesse woke to the creaking of old wood and the soft sound of breathing near the fireplace. The Labrador, still unnamed, was curled on the blanket, just as Jesse had left him. The fire had long since died, but the dog remained in that exact posture, unmoving, eyes half-lidded, but never quite asleep. Jesse sat up on the couch, knees aching from the stiff night, and watched him in silence. Later that day, while chopping wood out back, Jesse found himself muttering names aloud: Rusty, Buck, Marley, testing them on the wind like throwing stones into still water. None fit. The dog would lift an ear occasionally but never move. It was sometime around dusk, when Jesse was leaning against the fence overlooking the field, that a name from deep inside him surfaced. Kyle. He didn't know why he said it. Maybe it was a memory, maybe a dream-own of those war-born fragments that lived in the back of his mind like smoke trapped in a room. But the moment the word passed his lips, the dog's ears perked sharply. His head turned not fast, but with recognition. His amber eyes locked onto Jesse's. It froze Jesse in place. "Kyle?" he repeated, almost a whisper. The dog blinked and looked away. That night, Jesse sat by the fire, nursing a chipped mug of coffee, thinking about the man the name belonged to. Kyle Dawson had served with him overseas. Tall, red-haired, always cracking dry jokes even in the worst moments. He'd gone missing during a supply run in Kandahari's Humvee, ambushed. No one recovered. Jesse had heard conflicting stories. Some said he died in the blast. Others said he wandered off into the night with a wounded K9. No body, no closure, just another ghost. As the fire flickered low, Jesse finally spoke. "Lucky," he said gently, trying the name out loud. "You're lucky. You made it out, didn't you?" The Labrador didn't stir, but for the first time since he'd come home, Jesse saw the dog's tail twitch slightly, once, like a signal from somewhere deeper. Lucky. From then on, Jesse began to pay closer attention. Lucky didn't behave like a normal dog. He didn't sniff curiously at trees during walks. He didn't play. He didn't chase rabbits or bark at the wind. Instead, he moved with a precision Jesse knew well, clearing corners before Jesse rounded them, stopping at doorways and glancing back. He slept lightly, ears twitching at distant sounds, never letting himself fully rest. He was always positioned between Jesse and the nearest entrance, always guarding. One night, around 1 a.m., Jesse awoke to a low, guttural growl. He sat up immediately, heart kicking against his ribs. Lucky was by the front door, body tense, staring through the thin curtains at something outside. Jesse stood, grabbed the flashlight from the mantel, and slowly pulled the curtain aside. Under the skeletal shadow of a cottonwood, partially hidden behind brush at the edge of the property, sat a dark sedan. Its engine wasn't running, no lights, just parked. Jesse narrowed his eyes. He stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking beneath his weight. As soon as the flashlight beam flickered toward the car, Its taillights blinked on. Then, without any visible driver emerging, it backed slowly down the long gravel drive and disappeared into the trees. Lucky stood motionless at the door until the red glow was gone. Only then did he sit back down, still staring. Jessie locked the door, every latch, every bolt, and turned to the dog. "What the hell did they want?" Lucky didn't answer, of course. He just shifted slightly and lay down again, facing the door. That same night, Jessie pulled an old wooden chest from under his bidon he hadn't opened in 2 years. Inside were his service medals, folded uniforms, a broken watch that had once stopped during an IED blast, and a stack of letters most unopened. He didn't know what he was looking for exactly. Maybe a name. Maybe a date. Maybe proof that the past he'd buried hadn't actually died. Lucky sat near the bed, watching him in complete silence. The next day, Jessie visited Betty Kramer, the only neighbor for 3 miles. She was in her late 60s, round-faced and sprightly, with snow-white curls tucked under a gardening cap. She had lived in Denton her whole life and knew everything that moved within a 20-mile radius. When Jessie mentioned the sedan, her smile faded. "You say it just sat there? That's not the first time, sweetheart. Couple nights ago, I saw a car like that watching the end of my driveway too. Figured it was just a lost tourist." Betty bent down to scratch Lucky behind the ears. "He's a handsome one. Smart eyes. You'd think he's listening." "He is," Jessie said. "He always is." Betty glanced at Jessie with a quiet pause. "You look better with a dog around. Less haunted." Jessie didn't answer. Back at the cabin that night, Jessie stood at the window long after Lucky had settled onto the rug. The woods were quiet, the frost thickening on the grass. But Jessie's skin itched with awareness. He didn't know who was watching, or why, but he knew one thing for certain. Lucky wasn't just any rescue dog. He had training, history, and maybe even someone out there who still wanted him, just not for good reasons. The dog had come into Jessie's life with no name, no past. But now he carried the weight of both, and Jessie, who once vowed to never get close again, was already in too deep to walk away. The morning sky was steel gray as Jessie guided the truck through winding back roads leading to the outskirts of town. Lucky sat quietly in the passenger seat, his head low, eyes tracking every shift in light and movement through the window. His behavior hadn't changed, still reserved, still alert, but ever since that night with the strange car, a new kind of watchfulness had taken hold of him, one that Jessie could feel in the air around them. Today, he wasn't driving aimlessly. Today, he was taking a step into the past. Meredith Harper lived alone in a modest log cabin nestled between fir trees and overgrown wildflowers. At 72, Meredith had the rugged poise of someone who had spent most of her life outdoors. She was tall and lean, her hands weathered and strong, with deep crow's feet radiating from her eye size that missed nothing. She'd been the town's vet for 4 decades before retiring after her husband's passing. Her reputation for blunt honesty and quiet kindness had made her a fixture in the Denton community. Jessie remembered visiting her as a boy when their family retriever broke his paw chasing a deer. She answered the door before Jessie even knocked, wiping her hands on a faded blue apron covered in hay and fur. "Well, well," she said, her voice husky but warm. "I didn't expect to see a moor boy on my porch this early in the season." "Morning, Meredith," Jessie said. "I've got someone I'd like you to meet." She leaned forward, squinting at Lucky, who had already stepped out of the truck and stood beside Jessie like a quiet shadow. "Now that's a dog with a story," she murmured. "Come on in." Inside, the cabin was cozy and cluttered in the way of people who lived deeply alone. Books were stacked beside jars of homemade preserves. A wood stove burned softly in the corner, casting flickering light across old photographs of dogs, cats, and horses. Meredith led them to a back room that smelled of alcohol wipes and cedar. "Let's see what secrets you're keeping," she said as she retrieved a portable scanner from a drawer. Lucky stood perfectly still as she gently parted the fur at the base of his neck. When the scanner beeped, Meredith frowned. "Strange," she muttered, pressing a few buttons. The screen flickered, then glowed with fractured text. "This chip's been tampered with. Heavy formatting. Deliberate erasure." "Can you recover anything?" Jessie asked, stepping closer. Meredith tapped the screen, eyes narrowing. Only partials. No name, no owner. But look here, these three characters. KD, that's all I've got. Jessie stared at the letters like they were a ghost. Kyle Dawson. Meredith raised an eyebrow. That name means something? He was one of ours, Jessie said slowly. Disappeared in Kandahar 5 years ago. They said the dog with him didn't make it. Meredith exhaled through her nose and leaned against the counter. This kind of data removal doesn't happen on accident, Jessie. If someone went to this much trouble to wipe that chip, it means they didn't want this dog found, not by anyone. So what do I do? He asked, already knowing the answer. Meredith tilted her head slightly. Depends. You want to find the truth or keep breathing easy? Jessie didn't answer. Lucky brushed against his leg, and that was all the answer he needed. They left in silence, the cold wind picking up as they drove back into town. Jessie's mind turned like a rusted gear. He couldn't shake the way Lucky had reacted to the name Kyle. Couldn't ignore the training, the scars, the eyes that had seen things he couldn't begin to guess. That evening, just as the sun dipped behind the hills and shadows lengthened across the yard, Jessie heard the mail truck grind to a halt at the end of his driveway. He didn't think much of it at first until he walked out and found a small brown package sitting atop his mailbox. No label, no return address. Just his name in block letters, written with a black marker. He turned it over once, twice. It was light, but rigid. Back inside, he sliced it open with his pocket knife. Inside, carefully wrapped in a piece of cloth, was a single black and white photo. It had yellowed at the edges and carried the faint smell of tobacco. In the photo, a soldier knelt in the sand, one arm around a Labrador with a half-smile on its face, the wind stirring dust around them. The soldier's name tag wasn't visible, but Jessie didn't need it. It was Kyle. And the dog was Lucky. The desert in the background stretched into haze. Behind them, a wire fence, a guard tower, and faint outlines of armored vehicles. Jessie's stomach clenched. The photo had been taken after Kyle had supposedly died. Beneath the photo was a single folded slip of paper. No note, no explanation, just coordinates, scribbled in tiny, neat handwriting. Jessie stared at them for a long time. Lucky sat nearby, watching, ears raised, as if he knew that whatever came next would not allow them to return to what they once were. Jessie rose, walked to the fire, and tossed the envelope into the flames. But the photo, he kept that. It didn't belong to fire. It belonged to a man who'd vanished into silence, and a dog who carried the proof in his bones. By mid-December, Denton was buried under a deep layer of snow. The trees behind Jessie's cabin stood bare, their branches like skeletal fingers clutching at the gray sky. Wind howled through the cracks in the siding, rattling the windows with a slow, haunting rhythm. Jessie had been fighting off a fever for 2 days, a dull ache crawling through his joints and pounding behind his eyes. He'd refused to go into town stubborn as ever and tried to tough it out with blankets, canned soup, and grit. Lucky, ever watchful, hadn't left his side. That evening, the snow had fallen so thick it blanketed even the sound. Jessie barely remembered slipping from the couch to the floor, forehead soaked in sweat, vision swaying in and out like an old film reel. The fire in the hearth had died to embers, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own, then darkness. Outside, the town slept. Just across the fence line lived the Aldridges, a young couple new to Denton. Their 8-year-old son, Henry, had a mop of dark brown hair, wide hazel eyes, and the kind of imagination that made him disappear into the woods for hours, narrating battles against invisible creatures. He'd taken a liking to Lucky early on, often waiting at the fence with bits of jerky in hand, hoping for a visit. His parents, Megan and Brian, were kind, but often preoccupied with juggling remote jobs and a fixer-upper house that always seemed to need one more repair. That night, Henry had slipped outside without his coat, curious about the frozen surface of the old farm pond behind Jessie's property. The snow had stilled the world, and no one heard the crack of thin ice until it was too late. He went under fast silent, swallowed whole by winter. But Lucky heard. The Labrador had been curled at the foot of the couch, head resting beside Jessie's outstretched hand. His ears pricked first, then his head lifted sharply. A low growl formed deep in his chest, followed by a bark that echoed through the cabin like thunder in a chapel. When Jesse didn't stir, Lucky lunged toward the front door, claws skidding across the floor. With a force Jesse had never seen in him, Lucky launched through the flimsy window pane, glass exploding into the night. The cold hit like a blade, but Lucky didn't slow. He tore across the snow-covered yard, nose to the wind, sprinting toward the faintest of sound-splashing weak cries, the panic of a small boy struggling in freezing water. When he reached the pond's edge, Lucky barked with a ferocity that seemed to rattle the night itself. Inside the cabin, Jesse stirred. The barking came through his fever like a bell underwater. He blinked up at the ceiling, heart stuttering, and forced himself to his feet, legs shaking beneath him. He grabbed the flashlight, stumbled out into the snow in nothing but a flannel and jeans, and followed the sound. What he saw stole the breath from his chest. Henry was clinging to the icy lip of the pond, his body already blue at the fingertips. Lucky was at the water's edge, half in the freezing shallows, teeth gripping the boy's jacket to keep him from sliding further under. The dog didn't bark anymore, he just held on. Jesse crashed down beside them, plunging his arms into the water, grabbing Henry beneath his arms and hauling him out with a groan of effort. The boy was light as a bundle of sticks, gasping, eyes wide. Jesse pulled off his flannel and wrapped it around him, yelling toward the Aldridge house. Brian and Megan burst from their front porch moments later, Megan barefoot in the snow, screaming. Brian took Henry from Jesse's arms and sprinted back inside. Megan looked down at the dog, who was now sitting back, soaking and trembling. Was he the one who found him? Jesse nodded. God, Megan whispered, God bless that dog. The next morning, Denton was buzzing. Word traveled faster than any storm. Henry was recovering well-mild hypothermia, but nothing lasting. Local EMTs said if Lucky had been even 5 minutes later, the story might have ended in tragedy. A small article in the local paper featured a photo of Lucky beside a smiling Henry, with the caption, "Veteran's dog saves neighbor's child from frozen pond." That afternoon, Jesse got a knock on the door. She was in her mid-20s, with a notepad in one hand and a DSLR camera slung over her shoulder. Her name was Jenna Hartley, junior reporter from Billings, tasked with covering regional hero stories. She had a look of persistent curiosity. Freckles across her cheeks, blonde hair tucked into a wool cap, and a directness that reminded Jesse of soldiers who'd seen just enough to stop sugarcoating life. "I was told I'd find Lucky here," she said. "He's napping," Jesse replied, stepping aside. Jenna entered and immediately noticed the worn photo on the mantel. She paused. "You know who that is?" "I think I do," Jesse said. Jenna took a seat on the armrest of the couch and pulled out a USB drive. "I want to show you something. It's not public yet. It was flagged in a military archive but accidentally included in a press release years ago. I kept a copy. You might want to see it." She plugged the drive into Jesse's laptop and played a video. The grainy footage showed a firefight in the desert, bullets cutting through dust, soldiers retreating behind smoke. A voice yelled, "Fall back!" A man in tan fatigues darted through the chaos, holding the harness of a yellow Labrador. The dog led the way, turning back only to nudge the man's leg forward. The soldier turned briefly to the camera. His face was sunburnt, determined, familiar. Jesse's chest tightened. "That's Kyle Dawson," Jenna said quietly. "And that's Lucky." Jesse couldn't speak. The room felt smaller. Jenna leaned forward, voice low. Kyle was declared Kaya. But this footage was taken 4 months after that date, which means one of two things. He didn't die, or someone covered up what happened next. The Oregon coast was wrapped in a heavy mist that clung to the pine-covered cliffs like breath held too long. Jesse hadn't seen the ocean in years. The scent of salt, damp wood, and tide-worn wind felt strange after the brittle cold of Montana. He drove with the window cracked, one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting near Lucky, who sat quietly in the back seat, eyes scanning the world like he knew what they were searching for. Jenna had given him the address of a coastal veterinary clinic in a sleepy harbor town called Elmsway. Not much more than a few bait shops, weathered docks, and clapboard homes. It was the kind of place where people didn't ask many questions. According to the clinic records, a man named David Winters had been bringing in a yellow Labrador every few months for the past 3 years. Same height, same limp, same scar under the left ear. Jessie knew the signs. A man trying to stay invisible in a town that didn't look too hard. The clinic sat at the edge of a narrow road that ran parallel to the ocean. Its small porch sagged with age, the paint peeling in soft curls. Jessie parked across the street, took a long breath, and opened the door for Lucky. The dog jumped down with practiced ease and walked beside him without a leash. The two of them didn't speak. They didn't need to. Inside, the receptionista woman in her 40s with auburn curls and tired, kind eyes looked up and blinked. "Can I help you?" "I think I'm looking for someone," Jessie said. "His name might be David. He brings in a Labrador, looks just like mine." Before she could answer, the back door of the clinic opened, and a man stepped through. He was in his late 30s, perhaps early 40s, though the lines on his face made him seem older. He was lean, with sunken cheeks, and wore a flannel shirt too big for his wiry frame. His hair was cropped close, and a faint scar ran from his temple to just beneath his jaw. His eyes, a sharp steel gray, locked onto Lucky and froze. Lucky stood still for only a moment. Then, with quiet certainty, he walked forward, tail low, body trembling. He didn't bark, didn't whine. He simply pressed his head into the man's chest and stood there, leaning. The man's knees buckled slightly. He dropped to the floor and wrapped his arms around the dog, his body shaking. "Jesus," he whispered. "I didn't think. I never thought." Jessie stood nearby, silent. The man looked up, his voice raw. "You found him." "I think he found me," Jessie said. The man nodded slowly. "Name's not David. It's Kyle. Kyle Dawson." They didn't say much after that. They didn't need to. The silence between them was filled with things that didn't require explanation: loss, memory, the kind of brotherhood that exists between strangers who've seen the same dark corners of the world. Kyle invited them into the back of the clinic, which turned out to be a converted room he was renting above the facility. A mattress on the floor, a single chair, a kettle that whistled as he made tea with trembling hands. He told Jessie everything. How he'd survived the ambush by dragging himself and Lucky through the desert for 2 days before a private evac team found them. How the mission had been part of a black ops contract later buried by bureaucrats too afraid of public scrutiny. How his own chain of command had listed him as presumed dead to tie off loose ends. And how he'd chosen to stay hidden rather than let Lucky be taken back into the hands of the very people who abandoned them. "I couldn't go back," Kyle said, fingers curled tightly around the cup. "Not without risking him, not after what we survived." Jessie nodded. "You don't have to run anymore." Kyle looked at him, eyes hollow. "I don't even know who I am anymore." "You're someone who got a second chance," Jessie said. "And I think we both know a dog that's been trying to show us that." They returned to Montana the following week. Kyle rode in the passenger seat this time. Lucky stretched across the back, sleeping deeply for the first time since Jessie had known him. The drive was long but peaceful, each mile pulling them further from the silence and closer to something like healing. In the months that followed, the town of Denton welcomed Kyle with quiet understanding. No press, no big headlines. Just nods from neighbors, warm loaves left at the door, and enough time for a man to figure out how to breathe again. Together, Jessie and Kyle founded Second Light, a rehabilitation center built on the edge of Jessie's property. It started small, a barn converted into dorms, a classroom built from salvaged lumber. But word spread fast. Veterans came from across the state, men and women carrying scars, both visible and unseen many, accompanied by dogs rescued from shelters, pounds, and war zones alike. Lucky became the heart of the place. By now, he was older, his muzzle grayed, movements slower, but his presence had deepened. He would greet each new arrival with a gentle bump of his nose, sit beside them during their first therapy session, and rest near the fire each night, eyes half closed, as if watching over everyone. He didn't need commands, he just knew. Inside the main hall of Second Light, hung above the hearth, was a photograph taken just days after Kyle's return. Jessie, Kyle, and Lucky, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath a Montana sky. Beneath it were the words, "Some souls don't come home. but some come back to light the way. And some nights, quiet ones, when the snow fell softly and the world seemed to pause, Lucky would rise from his bed and walk slowly to the gate at the edge of the property. He would sit there, perfectly still, staring out into the night, as if he was still waiting, just in case there was one more soul out there trying to find their way home. Sometimes, the ones we rescue are the ones who carry the light we've lost. In Lucky's silent loyalty, in Jesse's quiet resilience, and in Kyle's long road home, we are reminded that healing doesn't always come in loud triumphs. It often walks in on four paws, sits beside us in the silence, and waits until we're ready to begin again. What we bury doesn't disappear, but when we face it together with trust, compassion, and courage, redemption becomes possible. And even broken things can lead us back to morning light. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more stories of courage and connection, and comment below. Tell us where in the world you're listening from. We'd love to hear from you.